So I'm going to briefly say a little bit about some of the last equations. This is the influencer equation. I call this the billion. It's a more than $1 billion equation because it's the equation that allowed Google to create Google search. And it's also the equation that's used by Instagram in order to tell us who the most popular people are and who we should follow. And what it does is it sort of warps our perception of who's important, not important in the world. And I argue in the book that you can reverse engineer this to give a sort of more balanced view of yourself. There's a mathematical result that your friends are always, on average, your friends are more popular than you are. And once you start to realize this, then you can actually start to relax about the fact that people appear to be more popular than you are. I also look at the learning equation, for example, and this is exactly the equation that YouTube use. And what they did is they just focused on taking viewer characteristics and video characteristics. They put them into this gigantic neural network, which uses the learning equation to maximize the predictions of watching time. And then it gives new suggestions of videos you should watch. This has both, again, it's like this sort of filter that shapes what you see. And if you're just sitting there watching YouTube video after YouTube, you've really been learnt by YouTube and it knows what you're doing. And a lot of these equations are used widely in across lots and lots of different applications. All the big social media giants use the types of equations I describe in the book. But what I wanted to conclude on is that, yes, I do think that mathematics can form a way of seeing the world in a simple rules. But what you have to do in order to let that into your life is you have to combine data, which is included in all of these books and everything that happens to you, plus the model. I've taken the Da Vinci Code here as an idea of a mathematical model underlying the whole world. And you put those two together and you get the 10 equations that rule the world and allow you to understand things better. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, David. That was incredibly interesting.
Oh, sorry, I couldn't hear you there, but okay.
I said that's certainly a 9 on your reward equation.
I don't know. Maybe everyone should put their score into the chat, and then we'll see.
It's also good to see that Pokemon Go still has a fan. So we're now going to move on to some audience questions. So audience, this is your cue. Please type any that you have into the Q&A box. We've already got some really interesting ones. So an anonymous audience member has said, we are seeing the rise of anti-intellectualism all around the Western world, immortalized in the famous "we've had enough of experts." Your worldview seems to be the polar opposite of that. Firstly, are you optimistic when you turn on the news? And what do you think about people who say, I don't care what the facts say, I know what I want to do?
Wow, I am optimistic. I think that's sort of in my nature. So, but also I think there's a reason to be optimistic. I think that we have access to data in a way that we simply didn't even have 10 years ago. So I live in Sweden, where Hans Rosling developed Gapminder, and his point was all about collecting data about everything that happens in the world. And his criticism was very much about the media, which didn't present that. Now we actually have access to data, and you can just think about the corona crisis. We're discussing and arguing about data, and we quite often use it. So I'm not that concerned about it. In the book, I take up, for example, I've mentioned Jordan Peterson a couple of times, or I mentioned him at the end there, and I take up him as an example of somebody who is having a pseudo-intellectual conversation in my world. That what he does is he ignores the fact there's data and he just discusses models. And what you can see in, for example, in against women when applying for jobs and discrimination in racial situations is an anecdote is never enough. You have to have lots of information that you put together to answer those questions. So now I think I'm going off target a little bit here, but my overall view in the book is one of optimism. And also I think I mentioned this with subjective, you can be subjective. You can still be subjective and disagree with each other. And and be using rational arguments. And I think that's very important to remember. I think often when people are having disagreements, they don't always understand the model that the other people are using. If two people start with very divergent models of the world, they can look at the same data, they can both change their models slightly, but they can still disagree with each other in the end. So I've taken lots of examples there, but it's a big question.
No, that's a really good answer. It was a big question. Okay, James has said the US election is mere days away, and polls are a central part of modern politics. What are some things to keep in mind when obsessing over polling numbers and models? You just mentioned models. And what are some tips to stay sane?
That's funny. I looked at that in my book Outnumbered. So my last book, what I did is I looked at Nate Silver has a website where they try and predict the election. I've seen The Economist are doing it now, and there's various other things. Is actually, in general, the science says that betting markets are the best way of making predictions. The betting markets have Trump quite high actually this year. They have him higher than he was last time. But I think one thing that was forgotten, I mean, so the betting markets last time, I think they put Trump as a sort of 30% chance of winning. And that's the sort of thing that happens. You know, I deal with football matches, and the weaker team has a 30% chance of winning, and often they win. You know, we don't win all the matches, and that never happens. So it doesn't mean that if you have a 30% chance last time and maybe has a 35% chance this time, that doesn't mean that he will win either. Either one of those two events can occur. How much weight would I put it? I think that, well, I personally check the betting markets, which are overall more reliable than the models that are created of that. I would believe that it's certainly not clear one way or the other based on the information overall. That's my answer to that.
All right. Robin has a really interesting question. He says, what do you think about the irony of social networks that use these equations to peddle conspiracies about false equations?
So in the book, I use the conspiracy theory idea quite a lot, actually. I didn't go into it because I just wanted to get straight to the facts. We're a how-to academy here, so we have to learn how to do things. But what I do in the book is I build up the people who use the equations as a society 10. And the idea is that this is a secret society, and how can they operate in this way? And here's the amazing thing: when I started to think about it, or I was going to put the equations up, but you know the picture I had of all the different equations. Now, if you're not a mathematician and you see all those equations, they're just gobbledygook. And that's how they communicate with each other. So the people who set up Google and Facebook and Instagram, they're all fluent in those equations, and they talk to each other in those equations, and they learn these equations, and they just become incredibly rich, and they become incredibly powerful. And it's not very clear what motives they have, but they're like a conspiracy theory. And so I don't think that, you know, the question was very nicely formulated, that they're peddling all these conspiracy theories, but they're actually part of a conspiracy theory in some way, and they don't even know that they're part of that conspiracy theory. And I think that's something that I really want to bring out, and I think is important for people to think about. It's both about improving your own mathematical understanding, but it's also for society to understand that a small group of people who have become incredibly rich by using these mathematical equations.
Scary stuff. Okay, we've had a couple of questions from anonymous attendees. One of them, for example, what practical steps or advice do you have for non-maths individuals who want to adopt these equations in their lives, but who look at numbers and equations and simply freeze or panic?
So I think there I try to keep the advice on the level of the advice I gave to Amy, that normally mathematics tells you to be a more forgiving person. I think and when I also talked about, for example, when you're using the confidence equation to have more confidence in things, you have like using star systems. So I take an example of TripAdvisor. If you're deciding where you're going to go on holiday, you should read around 16 reviews and take the average of those reviews in order to know that you're making an accurate decision. So normally from the confidence equation, the rule is take in more information than you might normally do. For the judgment equation, we've looked at that. It's often to be more forgiving. things aren't quite as dangerous as you think they are. For the market equation, I break things down into signal, that's what a product is actually worth, noise, how it fluctuates in the observations you have, and feedback, which comes back to the idea that when something is popular, I take three types of headphones. I take Sony as a dependable signal. I take a Japanese brand that no one's heard of as noise. And then I take Beats, lots of adverts and things around that as a kind of feedback example. And that's how people model the world using those equations. So you can actually learn that type of approach. So there's a lot of things you can learn just from finding out how mathematicians work with numbers, which you can apply to your own life. But in the end, if you really want to start doing this in detail, you have to learn the maths yourself.
That is also a scary suggestion. Big data and also learning statistics. We have a really interesting question from Lucy about the UK A-level algorithms. I don't know if it reached Uppsala, but the question is, why did nobody check on the system? What does it say about modern politics? And should the politicians involved be forced to read your book?
They should. So again, that's actually my last book was more, so Outnumbered was a kind of, I don't know if it was a more negative thing, but it was more about these limitations of algorithms. This is more, I'm trying to give a more positive message in this one. So I definitely think you should check out Outnumbered for that. I found in that book, first of all, I looked at Cambridge Analytica scandal and fake news and a lot of these things, and found that they weren't that big an issue. What I did found it was an issue was a lot of these biased algorithms. And the A-level example, I've written a Medium post about this if you're interested. The A-levels example is a perfect example of a biased algorithm, in the sense that it suggested that kids from poorer areas were more likely to have inflated grades from their teachers, which may have been a statistical pattern, but it's so stupid to say, we've got this statistical pattern, we're going to use this in algorithm to change people's grades. It just sort of, I don't know. I think that's an over-reliance on statistics, which shouldn't be allowed, really. So, but that happens all the time. That's one of the problems, is that there's a lot of algorithms are learning from biased data. Mostly the problem is, and this is what I found with Cambridge Analytica, they're just bullshit artists. They had no algorithm which worked at all. And there's a load of people who are out there selling these algorithms. They go into the government, they say, oh, I've got this algorithm which is going to help you with your A-level grading. And it all sounds very neutral and great, and it's an algorithm, and they put it in, and then everyone goes, well, what's my grades? You know, this is what I got. And it's so obvious. But unfortunately, people treat algorithms in this kind of neutral way, which they shouldn't. They should try and understand how they really work.
Great answer. Okay, so Stephanie has said, would you please comment on the process of modifying a model? For example, if data of a certain accumulates over time, how does one make certain type, how does one make a judgment whether or not to alter one's model? I mean, you mentioned earlier Nate Silver 538. They must have had a reckoning after 2016. How do you adjust your model?
Well, I think that's, if I can just share my screen, because I know not everyone will be equation. Well, I want to go, if I can just go back all the way to go through my whole talk now. Yes, if I go back to, this is what is really beautiful about Bayes' theorem. So what happens is this is what you estimate at the end. This is your shaking plane, or it's the comment that you've heard in the bathroom, or it's the thing about the mobile phones. And this is your model. What you do is you take this part and you put it back here. And when you put it back here, you get some new data in, you get a new model. And so this is actually an iterative equation, in the sense that you iterate through it time after time after time, and you can keep up model. And so to make it concrete in the example of Amy and Rachel, if the next day Rachel does something horrible again, then Amy should start to be thinking, then it's maybe getting to about 40% chance that she's not a very nice person. And if she does it a third day, then yeah, actually you have to change your judgment. But as you'll get more and more information, you update what you do. And I think that's one of the very interesting that you asked about Nate Silver and how they work. What's very interesting there is that they use quite a lot of subjectivity in their model building based on exactly the type of thing that you're talking about, that they find that their models aren't working, and just because they're not working, they change them around using some sort of subjective information, but they use the judgment equation to build in their subjective information.
Fascinating. So Alex has said, when did you start applying these formulas to your life, and why?
I think actually most recently when I wrote the book, to be absolutely honest. I mean, I don't think that I apply them in the way that I'm describing them as formulas just now, or I probably do with the judgment equation, but it's more a sort of feeling. In fact, there was that other question about how you use mathematics if you don't use mathematics. So that's what affects me. When I'm thinking about buying headphones, I'm thinking about these three different influences. When I'm thinking about other people, often like my boss does something which I'm just so annoyed at, I just think, okay, if I'm using Bayes, then I should be thinking in that way. And I've probably thought about it before I wrote the book. I think I'm quite a balanced person in that way. But when I wrote the book, it became more clear to me that I was actually both using mathematics in my everyday thinking. And it's actually, I mean, it's been maybe not specifically that of using it, but a lot of this has been a journey for me as a person, because I've started to think a lot about how I actually think, and how maybe it was how I thought before I became a mathematician that made me a mathematician, if you see what I mean. So I already had this type of way of thinking, and then that was why I chose to become a mathematician. So I've had reflections of that type from after I've written the book.
Amazing. And one final question to wrap it all up. Alwyn has said, thanks for a great talk. Are there any honorable mention equations that could have been included over the other 10? That's quite a tough question. There's already 10.
There wasn't in the end. So when I wrote the book proposal, I had one equation that didn't make it. That was an equation with the equation that underlies is called I've forgotten, it's got out of my head for some reason, but it's the equation that underlies Bitcoin and cryptocurrencies. It's an elliptic curve equation. That's what it's a solution to elliptic curve. And there's some interesting things around that, but that didn't make it because it didn't quite fit into it. There wasn't much you could learn from elliptic curves. So I dropped that one, and I ended up putting in the learning equation, which I mentioned briefly at the end, to do with YouTube. What I do in that chapter is I actually show that all of modern artificial intelligence can be built with the learning equation plus all the other 8 equations that come before it. And so that I felt was a sort of, if you can build all of we know in AI just now using these 9 equations, then it's kind of evidence that we've got most of what we currently know about mathematics in there. And then the 10th equation is a more logical statement, how we bring morality back into these equations. So how should we use our moral judgment in when we're thinking?
Wow. Well, I lied about the final question because there's one that's just popped in, but this is the final one. Jan has said, and you'll see why I feel desperate to ask it. Which equation is most useful for a good and harmonious relationship based on your marriage? So there's high stakes for this answer, David.
Yeah, I think it's different in lots of different cases, but I will say that the reward equation is personally, I mentioned this thing to do with my wife playing Pokemon Go, and that's personally quite important to me because my wife, she has had quite a lot of chronic pain over the last few years, and Pokemon Go has allowed her to focus on one thing. And a bit like sometimes maybe I'm annoyed with my kids using their mobile phones. Sometimes I can be annoyed with my wife's obsession with Pokemon Go. But what I realized was that she was using that to block out all of this crap that was going on and just be able to focus and not have to focus on her pain. And so for me personally, the reward equation is the absolute most important equation.
Oh, that's a lovely place to end. Sadly, we're gonna have to wrap up there. As mentioned earlier, please everyone do go check out David's new book, The 10 Equations That Rule the World, which is out now. And do head over to the How To Academy website to hear some more speakers. David, thank you so much for your fascinating talk.
Thank you.
Thank you, audience, for tuning in and for all of your brilliant questions.
Very good questions. Thanks for them.
Amazing. We hope to see you all soon. And thank you, David.